Well, hello out there in TV land. We are in Mark chapter 5 and 6 tonight, and we will walk through some key ideas from the second half, the backside of chapter 5, and then we'll get into some things from chapter 6. Appreciate Andrew Dodd filling in for me last week. Had an enjoyable experience teaching some younger people last week. And they were excellent in their attentiveness, and we appreciate them and the way they're being raised. So again, go to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 20. Let's begin in verse 21. Matthew 5 and verse 21. Barry, do you remember how far Andrew got last week by any chance?
I am going to say right around there. I remember we spent a lot of time talking about the Jersey demoniac for sure, Legion, etc.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to say if we did start with 21, it was very brief.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty much 80 to 90% of it was the first 20 verses.
All right. Thank you. So in verses 21 through the end of the chapter, there are, I think, three different things that are important, have been important to me, that might be important to others that study this. And so I want to do this in more of a somewhat of a faster summary than I do a verse by verse, individual verse by verse look. We'll certainly look at some verses there throughout the rest of Matthew 5. But then again, we'll get into chapter 6. What I see in Matthew 5:21 running through the end of the chapter are three particular things that are important to the Christian about the nature of Jesus. These are things about the nature of Jesus that I think matter. So let's start in verse 21. And I think these things will be helpful and encouraging to us as we consider this nature of Jesus. So we begin in verse 21, Jesus crossing over again by boat to the other side. We see this often. We see the multitudes gathering around him. Large crowds followed him wherever he went, Scripture says. He's by the sea. And one of the rulers of the synagogue comes up to him in verse 22. His name's Jairus by name. And he fell at the feet of Jesus, and he begged him earnestly and said, "My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her that she may be healed, and she will live." So Jesus went out with him, and a great multitude followed him and thronged him. The close of verse 24 reminds us of something that we see throughout the Gospels. A great multitude followed him. Many of us remember when Princess Diana was killed. And we remember that for her and others like her, through whether it be the U.S. or other nations, people of some level of fame, notoriety, for a lot of different reasons, receive what they call a constant following of the paparazzi. And that's that reporter pool and who's writing for this magazine, who can get the scoop on that first. Y'all remember that? And they'll chase them everywhere. And you think, what's it like to be one of these people of this much fame and notoriety or wealth or whatever it is that has people following them? And what they would give to just not be followed everywhere they go, or hounded, or asked a question. You think about when the President of the United States, through the years, whoever it is at the time, goes into that small room and they got all those reporters and he's giving a press conference, or if he's not doing it, more often it's the press secretary, it's his press secretary or speech writers. And there's a staff of those that you got your primary person, and then sometimes that person's being subbed for by somebody else. And or sometimes you see a president taking questions from the media. And then they'll say, well, one more, he'll answer a question, and then everybody's shouting. And somebody's got to say, your question, please. And everybody else has to be quiet. from shouting their own. Okay, he'll take that question now. And then it's the next person. And eventually they can only take so many, and he's got to go. Well, what's happening when he leaves? They're still shouting questions at him. They still shout. And until you see whether it's the press secretary in a press briefing or it's the president himself, they're still shouting, and they take him out and then out that. And I've been in that room, by the way. My family's been in that room in the White House, and that I was in fourth grade, and that Jimmy Carter was president then. Yes, and my dad had an in there. Uh, President Carter's primary speechwriter at the time was one of Dad's former students. And Dad was up there to do a specialty thing through her that she was putting together with um, principles of communication for speechwriters, which Dad taught in his doctorate level and so on. And so he got to bring the family and so on. So we got to tour around the White House. It's a small room. It's not a very big room. But they all walk usually to the right, out to his right, and then out through a door. And as they're going out that door, they're still shouting at him. In fact, he's already made the corner down the hall, and they're still shouting like he's going to step back in and say, "Great question." No, he's not going to do that. This is what must it be like to be Jesus? Well, here's one truth that the first set of verses, Mark 5, verse 21 through 24, tell us. Jesus was always hospitable to the people that were hounding him. It wasn't, that's all I got time for, fellas. You didn't see the hand go up. You don't get that picture in Scripture. It's not, hey, I got to go. He's always hospitable to those that are hounding him. So you might say Jesus is hospitable to the hounds. Now keep that in mind. I'll say it that way so it's easier to remember. He's hospitable to the hounds. Keep that in mind because there's two more things that are important about Jesus that, again, are helpful to me. How does Jesus feel about me? Lord, I'm coming to you again. Maybe it's in prayer, perhaps. I'm coming to you again. I'm coming to you again. I know you're probably tired of me asking for this. You're probably tired of me saying I don't understand this or that. You're probably, and we thought, well, I can't. I'm going to have to say something else. I need to talk about other things with him. And maybe I do need to talk about other things with him too. But the idea that I can't talk with him about this thing anymore because he's heard all he needs to hear from me about it. Jesus was always hospitable to people that were hounding him. Now get in verse 25. We've got a second thing that starts right here. You got the lady that had the bleeding condition for 12 years. She's been suffering. Verse 26. She spent all that she had. She's not getting any better. You get down to verse 27. She's heard about Jesus, and she comes up behind him in the crowd and touches his garment because this is what she believed. Verse 28. If only I could touch his clothes, I could be made well. And she's referencing most likely then the outer garment, the free-flowing outer garment robe. And you can remember how that might be just flowing as they walk. You know, if you put on a big bathrobe, unless it's too small, if you put on one that fits you just like it's supposed to, or even a little bigger, and you had something else underneath it, and you're walking down the hall, it's going to be flowing a little bit, right? Well, that means if somebody comes up and barely touches that, she didn't have the idea, and it's not even worded this way, that if I get on that and pull really hard on that outer garment, and they did have an outer garment and an inner garment. That's why Jesus would say, you picture this and remember these words. If somebody asks for your outer garment, your cloak, give him your inner one too. Remember that? So he's flowing, this outer garment is flowing as he's walking along and crowds are all around him. She just wants to if I could just brush that outer garment. He's not going to feel that. He's not going to feel it. It's not up against his body. And the idea is not that she's tugging as hard as she can on it. If I could just... And what comes next is Jesus stops and asks the question of the disciples, who touched me? Now imagine being Peter. Imagine being one of the disciples, and they say it right there. We see them say, basically they're saying, what do you mean who touched you? In fact, I wonder if they're not thinking, who's not trying to touch you? In this throng of people, Who's not reaching for you in some way, or at least calling out to you? So you got the distractions of the verbal call out to him and those that are actually physically trying to get to him. And in the press of this crowd, I've seen a lot of footage. I'm a nut about the Kennedy assassination. Okay, and read books on that and that kind of thing. It's just intriguing. I wasn't even alive when that happened. That was 3 years before I was born, a little over 3 years before I was born. And but I love reading about it, and I see those photos or those videos of him in Dallas at the airport prior to getting and going where he would ultimately be shot, and he's reaching across, and the Secret Service didn't like the fact that he was reaching into the crowd where somebody could have that type of access to him. But and you see them doing this, they're shaking hands and they're kissing babies and all that. That's the picture that you get when Jesus is being thronged about by large crowds. And they say, how are we supposed to know which one you mean as you're walking through probably a narrow corridor of people and everybody's reaching for you? But see, Jesus knows. And here's what we need to know about Jesus through that process. He's not just hospitable to people that are hounding him, but he eventually, a few verses later, and we're going to read it, Jesus praises the peskiness of those that are trying to get to him. He praises it. He's not irritated by it. He praises it. In fact, he equates it to faith. Read a little further. He's equating it to faith. Look at verse 29. Immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself the power had gone out of him, turned around and said, Who touched my clothes? But his disciples said to him, You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, Who touched me? And he looked around to see who had done this thing. But the woman, and she's fearing and trembling, Scripture says, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. He praises her faith for the pesky attitude that she had to get to and get after Jesus. So much so that she wasn't thinking she needed to ask for anything. I just want to touch him, and I think I can be healed. So you've got a Jesus that has this nature. You've got a Jesus that has the nature of not minding, but actually not just not minding, but being very hospitable to people like Jairus who are getting after him, trying to get after him. How many requests was he receiving? But he went with Jairus instead of, do you know how many requests I get on a daily basis? he went with Jairus, and then you get to the next set of verses, and you got the lady with the bleeding condition. And what does the word pesky mean to us? When I think of pesky, I think of a fly. Mosquito. What? Annoying. Yeah, annoying. I think of having to do this a lot. If something's pesky, it's, and man, it's insatiable. They are insatiable. That mosquito, that fly, maybe it's a small child tugging on the pant, or do you have a friend or the neighbor or somebody that would do this all the time, tap you on the shoulder? My wife, if I want to irritate her, I know what to do. I'm going to walk up and just do this. So she could take about 2 taps. But if I go more than twice, she's going to, what? Stop. I hate to be. And that came from being a longtime school teacher with elementary school kids. And she just, the tap, 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 tap. So get that scene. This is what she wants to do. And Jesus praises this. He doesn't correct her. He doesn't anything but praise her. And so you've got a Jesus that's hospitable when we're hounding him. And it's not toleration type hospitality. Sometimes you can confuse toleration with hospitality. But here's how we know his hospitable nature is beyond toleration. but it's actually will not, and it goes beyond willing. It goes to wanting that peskiness, not just tolerating it, because he praises it and calls it faith. And his nature to know when somebody was reaching tells us he doesn't mind. Why was that his nature? It's who he is. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And all the natures that we can mention about God the Father, we can mention about Jesus the Son. I and the Father are one. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And so we know he wasn't just being tolerant in the first set of verses when Jairus said, I've got a daughter and I need some help. We know he's not just being tolerant and willing, but that he wants it. He praised that woman and he called it faith. So go to verse 35. He's still speaking, and some come from Jairus' house and they say, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? It's a waste of time. And as soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not be afraid, only believe. And he permitted no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue. Verse 38. They saw the tumult and those who wept and wailed loudly. So try to see that scene and hear that sound. When he comes into all that in verse 39, and he says, why make this commotion and weep? This child is not dead but sleeping. And verse 40 says they ridiculed him. Can you imagine? We would say from our angle today, we would say, do you know who you're ridiculing? Are you sure you want to do this? Do you know who you're in ridicule of at this moment? You're in ridicule of the one that can, well, they're about to see, heal the sick and raise the dead. But before that, who put it all into motion in the first place? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And it says that nothing was made without Him. John chapter 1. Nothing was made without Jesus. So, that's who they're... Can you imagine ridiculing Him? But when he had put them all outside, still in verse 40, he took the father and the mother of the child and those who were with him and entered where the child was lying. Now, I'm going to pause right here to say, he had no doubt, we know this, whatsoever. He knew what he was about to do. It's just like in John chapter 11. In John chapter 11, it's Lazarus. In Mark chapter 5, it's others. It's Jairus' daughter right here. In John 11, it's Lazarus. He waits 2 days. He waits an extra day before he comes. He was always coming. They didn't have to convince him to come. And he knew his delay would cause what it caused, but he also knew that their need was greater. They had a greater, deeper, ultimately more sustaining need than the mere alleviation of a brief time of trouble and pain and sorrow. He knew in John 11 they needed something that was better and ultimately would be more sustaining than just the alleviation of pain. He knows it right here, and he knows who he is. And he knows what he's going to do when he goes in that room and puts everybody else out and closes the door. And we get the description and the conversation here. And he says to her, Talitha Kumi, which is translated, little girl, I say to you, arise. Now verse 42, immediately the girl arose and walked, for she was 12 years of age. And they were overcome with great amazement. Now, we've got a Jesus in this set of verses that is hospitable when people are trying to get after him. He praises the peskiness of people doing that. And he doesn't mind at all correctly, there's a correct way of looking at what I'm about to say and an incorrect way of being put to the test. Now, we could think of the other side of that idea. Do not put the Lord your God to the test. It's not a good idea to test my word, is what he's saying. Don't test my word. Don't test my tolerance. Don't test my, you know. But in this sense, he doesn't mind being put to the test. And I like to call this section, Jesus prefers to prove. He doesn't just mind proving, he prefers. Because a picture is going to be, and this story going forward, 10 minutes after this happened, it's out and it's getting around. He knows his proving himself. I am who I say I am. Proving who he is, proving his power, proving the trustworthiness of his nature and of his words. He knows that's what he came to do. His signs and wonders were to give evidence of his being, of who he was. So we've got a Jesus, and this is what's been helpful to me, that never minds being hounded. And that praises that as faith. And that never minds having to prove himself. Now, the backside of that last thing, so Jesus is hospitable to the hounds, he praises the pesky, and he actually prefers, doesn't just mind it, he prefers to prove. Because once you see it, now you've got something that you can go tell about from your life. Now, on the back side of this passage, there's verse 40, the last verse. After they're overcome with great amazement, to close out verse 42, you hit verse 43, but he commanded them strictly that no one should know it, and that something should be given her to eat. That's kind of a hard thing to keep. That's kind of a hard thing to keep quiet, right? You know, Jesus always knew what time it was in his ministry. Because we ask this question sometimes. I've received this question a lot. Why would Jesus not want? If signs and wonders, if the purpose of his signs and wonders, remember what John wrote? He wrote it this way. Many other signs and wonders did Jesus in the presence of many witnesses, which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you might believe, and believing might have life in his name. If the purpose of his signs and wonders was to confirm his message and his person, who he is, then why did he not want? Well, Jesus looked backwards in Mark. Just kind of, you turn the page, you got a full chapter of parables in chapter 4 until you come up with when he calms the storm, which then leads into chapter 5. The last thing in chapter 4, he's calming the storm. Everything else in chapter 4 are parables. But what he's already done is in Mark chapter 2, he's healed a paralytic. Opening Mark 3, he is healed on the Sabbath. In Mark chapter 1, Peter's mother-in-law was healed. Also after that, starting in verse 32, many others healed. Starting in verse 40 of Mark chapter 1, he cleanses a leper. Earlier in Mark 1, he cast out an unclean spirit. Word has already begun to travel. That's why the large crowds are there. So why then, if he's already doing things which are clearly spreading like wildfire, the news, so much so we know it's happening because the crowds are gathering because they're hearing about this, why does he say not to tell? And my only answer there is Jesus always knew. He knew what he had to do. He already knew he was going to have enemies. He knew what they would plot to do, which they would, of course, eventually do. And He knows what time it is in His ministry. And there were times when Jesus had to get out of town. And that's the only answer I know to give. But do you know what we find true when He goes somewhere else? And after He tells something like this that wraps up chapter 5, even after He gives them the shh, don't tell anybody, He's going to go do the same stuff somewhere else. He's not going to cease doing or cease being who He is and doing what He came to do. But He always knows what time it is in His ministry. And He knows where He needs to be. Do not let yourself ever forget that we serve a Lord and we can talk to God in this way. He doesn't mind me hounding Him. He considers it faithful. And He's just fine proving Himself. Now, on the proving Himself, final point on that is this. What might I have to do for Him to be able to prove Himself? Well, I mean, if you were trying to be too literal, and obviously this is not the answer, you'd say, well, I have to be at the point of death. No. I just need Him to show Himself. Is it possible that if I would take more faith-building risk, and I'm talking about appropriate risk, there is a stewardship aspect to risk. I mean, I do have to have proper stewardship of myself, my body, all kinds of things. There are some things I don't do because it's not proper stewardship of my body. And stewardship is beyond just the giving of your means. It's taking care of and proper management of everything that God has given me. Be it my material well-being, my body, what goes into it, my health in general, my influence, my time, all kinds of things. I got to properly manage all that has been put in my lap and given to me, much of it obviously undeserved. And I manage that as best I can because He did this for me. So obviously I'm talking about proper risk. But I have said this time and time again, and I've said it in the pulpit here, and I've said it in other places many times. I believe some people have a hard time seeing God, seeing God's hand, seeing Jesus, because they will not put it all out there so that He can prove Himself. I'm going to have my hands on everything. I'm going to manage everything. I'm going to hold everything. I'm going to keep everything. They don't let God show Himself. They don't let God prove Himself. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse and see if I don't open up the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that you won't even have room to receive it. Malachi 3, verse 11. People don't give what necessarily always give, whether it's time, money, or combination of a lot of things of themselves, because I'm going to lose something if I give. So, Ananias and Sapphira. So I'll pull back a little. I don't want to lose something. And in never really taking a risk, a God-ordained, proper faith risk, they don't let God prove that He said, I'll take care of you, Matthew 6. Consider the lilies of the field, the birds of the air. We sing a song about it. Consider the lilies of the field. They toil not, neither do they spin. Birds of the air, your heavenly Father feeds them. Shall He not much more? What about clothing? Shall He not much more clothe you? He's talking about the grass of the field, clothe you, owe you a little faith. We don't let God prove Him. If we don't let God prove Himself to us, we will not be overwhelmed by the power and love of God like we could be, because we've got nothing to put on God's resume. If I'm building a God resume, what He's done in my life, how He's continued to be faithful to me. Great is thy faithfulness, we sing. If I don't allow God to allow me to have something to put something on His resume, then when I'm in the middle of struggle, I don't have anything for confidence. But I've never allowed Him. Go hold your place right here. If you're following along with us online, hold your place right here and go to James chapter 1. So after the introduction of verse 1, look at chapter 2, which is talking about profiting in the midst of trial, verses 2 through 8. My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. You may have perseverance. Now look at what happens in the next set of verses. But let patience have its perfect work, that you can be made perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Verse 5, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. Verse 6, but let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for he who doubts is like a wave of the sea, driven and tossed by the wind. For let not that man suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He's a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Let, verse 9, by the way, the lowly brother glory in his exaltation. So where are all these lets? I remember when I was quite young, and I don't know why I still remember this. I couldn't tell you anything else about the sermon except its subject or its title. Its title. And from the title and from these set of verses, I know what it was about. But I can't tell you specific things. But I remember when my dad preached a sermon when I was quite young, in the younger teenage years, probably more like 14 or so, called Let God Let Something Happen. I think there are too many times, too many people wanting God to deliver, but they're not putting anything out there to let Him show Himself. And so they're not amazed by the power of God, the love of God, the compassion of God. They have a hard time filling up a God resume in their life, from their life, because they haven't put anything out there enough to let Him show Himself. Well, He doesn't mind proving Himself. But I have to play a part in that. So that's Matthew chapter 5. And those three ideas have helped me personally tremendously through the years. To remember that He doesn't mind being hounded. He calls it faith, and He's just fine with proving Himself to you. But I have to play a part in that. So you get to chapter 6. He went out from there and he came to his own country, and his disciples followed him. When the Sabbath had come, he began to teach in the synagogue. This is interesting to me because he's just said, don't tell anybody. Who's around the synagogue? Chapter 6, verse 2. Who would hang around the synagogue? Yeah. All those that will be his nemesis or attempt to be his nemesis for most of his ministry time. And many hearing him were astonished, saying, where did this man get these things? And what wisdom is this which is given to him, that such mighty works are performed by his hands? Okay, he's in the synagogue and it's being said there. Which points back to, though, don't tell anybody. That's just interesting to me that don't tell anybody. And it's already here and it's already made it to the synagogue. And then verse 3, is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us? Now, the backside, the closing of chapter 6, verse 3 is interesting. And I want to see what else is said in other translations. You may have a translation that says the same thing mine does. So they were offended at him. Does anybody have anything that says something besides they were offended at him? Close of verse 3.
It just says they took offense at him.
Took offense? Now, why are they saying that? Well, they're saying that because who do you think you are coming in here and telling us this? Right? Who do you think you are coming in here and telling us this? You're not some whatever they would have said after that, whatever they were thinking. You're a carpenter. You're not a teacher of the law. You're a carpenter. Um, in fact, we saw you grow up, Dad. You're the son of Joseph and Mary, and we know your sisters, and we know you're just, hey, you're just like one of us. Where's all this coming from? In other words, where's all this coming from? Do you know what the heading of my Bible says at the start of chapter 6, where you sort of divide into chapters and verses and then to individual sections, and sometimes we have a heading over a section? It says, Jesus rejected at Nazareth. So can you finish this for me? In the prophecy about the coming Christ in Isaiah, what was prophesied to be the case? Yeah. He came into his own, and his own received him not. He came into his own, and his own received him not. If you can't get accepted by your own, now what in human nature, what makes that possible in human nature? Well, they know too much about you. They've seen your flaws, right? Imagine a school teacher who, like for instance, okay, so my dad was a university professor, right, for 34 years, all the time that he was preaching, of course. But he was a professor there for 34 years. And he'd be holding a meeting somewhere, and Dad would have a former student approach him uh, and say, "Dr. Collin, do you remember? Do you remember me? Well, I was in your class." And Dad would say, "Well, when was that?" Now, let's say it had been 10 years earlier. And Dad would generally say, if he didn't know them, he'd say, "Don't be offended." He said, "When you've taught as many students as I have for that many years, you only remember the notorious ones. You only remember the notorious ones." And one reason that some call it whether it's an elementary school teacher or a college professor or anything in between, is when your past, at least maybe way back in your past, you sure were not the person they thought would wind up doing what you're doing now, or acting like you're acting now. It's just hard for them to believe. They kind of get a wow moment because, well, all I can remember is, this. I was speaking at my home church for homecoming there they had years ago out at Bellevue. And a lady came in, my wife was with me, and a lady come up, and the very first thing that she said to me was, "I remember when he used to go up and kick people in the shin and run off." And I have no recollection of running up and kicking people in the shins and running off when I was a PK, preacher's kid, right? And I found out, well, another lady, and then confirmed by another lady, and then another lady. So two different ladies in the congregation. Then my mother, then my sister, all confirmed, yes, that happened, but it was only one time. So far as they ever knew. About one time I ran up and just thought it'd be funny. I'd kick it. I said, "How old was I?" And they said, "Oh, 4." But when you come up and say, "Oh, here's the guy that used to run around kicking people," what does somebody think? Well, he was like that all the time. Yeah, I mean, that's just his nature. He would go do that all the time, right? And so people are funny. As they're human, they're also funny. And they're holding in their minds what Jesus can't do that much about what's in their mind from his past, as they're seeing him as just one of them. And so they're going to reject it. They reject it. And then you get to verse 4, and you said it earlier, but Jesus said to them, "A prophet's not without honor except in his own country, among his own relatives, and in his own house." Verse 5, "Now he could do no mighty work there except that he had laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them." That's not mighty, I guess. He could do no mighty work except he could heal people. Whatever. Boy, I'd hate to see or I'd love to see a mighty work, right? And he marveled because of their unbelief. I guess so. Why are these crowds following? Why has word already traveled to the synagogue of all places, despite saying, don't tell anybody right now? He marveled because of their unbelief. Then he went about the villages in a circuit teaching. It was time to go somewhere else and to do something else. Jesus always knew what time it was. Don, how are we doing on time? Got a minute or two? All right, we'll summarize what comes in verses 7 through 13. He's going to send out the 12. So let's read that. And he called the 12 to himself and began to send them out two by two and gave them power over unclean spirits. By the way, two by two has always interested me, and I don't have much to say about it except this to me continues, and other things in the Gospels, through Jesus' ministry, it continues to remind me of the practical nature of Jesus' teaching and the practical nature of ministry. Effective ministry is reasonable. And Jesus cared for people, and he cared for those that would be his closest disciples. And he knew he was sending them. Later he'd say, I send you out as sheep among what? Among wolves. So Jesus is practical in his ministry and in his instruction. He commanded them to take nothing for the journey except a staff, no bag, no bread, no copper in their money belts, but to wear sandals and not to put on two tunics. Also, he said to them, in whatever place you enter a house, stay there until you depart from that place, and whoever will not receive you or hear you, when you depart from there, shake the dust off your feet as a testimony against them. Surely I say to you, it will be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. What Jesus is talking about right here before the shaking of the dust is you're going to be cared for. You don't need to take, you don't need to take, you don't need to be viewed as being on the take. You don't need to take because I'm going to handle it. You don't need to be viewed as on the take. You just go, you be in trust of me, and I'm going to handle things. The backside of what we just read right there, saying in verse 11, especially verse 10 and 11, but especially verse 11, we know this picture of the shaking the dust off the feet. You notice he never says, and never return to that town. He doesn't say anything about the worthlessness of those people to hear the message. And he doesn't say, don't return. But he always knew what time it was, just like we talked about earlier. He knew what time. There would be evidence given as to whether it's the right time for your message to that person. And if it's not, it doesn't have anything to do with the message. It's the timing of their reception, the ability to receive. But guess what? He doesn't tell them go back home and just do something else. Shake off the dust. And what do we know they were doing? They would go somewhere else. So they went out, verse 12, and preached that people should repent. And they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and healed them. This picture in Mark 6, verses 7 through 13, remind me, we're all familiar with this old phrase, the show must go on. And you do what you can, you say what you can, and you do what you can, where you can, how you can, and you let the Lord handle it. You don't beat your head against an unreceptive wall. It doesn't mean there won't be reception greatly improved, the likelihood of reception at another time. Some people need to have a life happen to them before their mind gets changed. They need some life happening to them. Then they'll start thinking about some other things. There's somewhere else to go. There's something else to do, and there's somebody that will hear. And that's the reminder that we need to keep with us. Practical messaging about being a disciple of Christ and talking to other people. Jesus was always practical in his messaging. He's not unrealistic in his expectations. He knows what he made. He knows the human nature and the human condition. So he gives practical advice to the disciples. And that means it's okay to behave that way and not, but what about, oh, I hate to get away from, it's okay to do that. In fact, he tells them to do that. So, Jesus understands. Okay, that's all we got time for tonight. We thank Don for handling this for our people in TV land. And next week, we got chairs for you too in here or back in there.